Thanks, Alexi. Good morning, everyone. Saturday morning, 9 a.m., and already we're talking about hashtag collisions. It sounds a bit scary. I hope breakfast was tasty. We're going to try and keep things light-hearted today and not dwell too much on the specifics of Fountain, but I wanted to talk about texting and why we're excited about it. So quick show of hands before we begin. How many of you wake up in the morning really pumped about messaging? That's what I thought. Okay, so let's talk about that. There's so much love and hate about text messaging, right? It's an old school technology. It's mostly evocative of awkward, best case scenario, autocorrect scenarios, right? And that's pretty much the only thing that seems to be relating to natural language processing when it comes to texting, right? So in many ways, texting actually sucks. It's obviously rudimentary, it's slow, particularly on mobile phones, which we all seem to be glued to and have now grown an appendage in the form of an iOS or an Android device, right? It's just painstakingly slow to the point that a significant fraction of the work that goes into designing user experience on a mobile phone goes toward trying to find workarounds so you never have to type, right? What kind of sensors are we going to be able to use? What kind of widget are we going to be able to put together? Can we use the camera to avoid texting, right? Voice, obviously, and video as well have much better throughputs. They're also not as tone deaf. You can carry a lot of non-verbal signal through voice and video, right? We've probably all been in more than a few incidents where some kind of email thread escalated very quickly just because we were lacking in tone perception, right? And yet, text is absolutely ubiquitous. We count the number of text messages sent daily in the billions. And there's probably a reason for that. Obviously, lots of qualities counterbalance the stuff we just talked about. It's asynchronous. Sender and receiver can process this not only at different times, but at different speeds. It completely decorrelates what's going on between the two sides. Actually, it's not just two sides. It's ready for one-on-one, but also one-to-many or many-to-many connections, right? From a cognitive standpoint, it's actually much cheaper. We perceive voice as being the more natural thing to do, but it actually takes a lot of work to listen, to speak, to react to what's going on in real time while paying attention to your surroundings. So that's actually not that cheap. Text is naturally, archivable, searchable. Obviously, nowadays you see a lot of stuff going on around automatic transcription, right? That's certainly available. It's not just that widely deployed, right? Whereas text is, something that you just check a box on your RDS instance, and you get all kinds of indexation and search capabilities, right? Because of that, while it's true that texting is certainly not the most efficient medium, it's often perceived to be, right? And that's probably why we end up spending an hour texting back and forth with someone when we could have been picking up the phone and be done with it in like 2 minutes, right? There's this sense that with the immediacy that you get, particularly if you interact with a system and not a human being, you get instant feedback. And we all know that we are hooked on these sort of feedback loops where there's constant stimulus happening back and forth, and suddenly you feel like something's moving really fast. That's great, that's fun, right? So some have labeled texting the most comfortable UI, right? It allows all these characteristics we just described, and essentially are perceived as superior even though they're objectively not that great, right? In fact, what's interesting is that texting remains ubiquitous even though there's often like an app for that, right? That's very much the case that we've seen a massive explosion in the number of apps that specialize in doing a specific thing much better than texting can, right? Often though, they require us to learn something. So the interface that we're all used to when it comes to texting is one that doesn't carry immediately over into just any app you pick up. You have to learn how it works, right? So that's annoying. It also is the case that apps fall short when it comes to expressiveness, right? What you get in specialization, you lose in the ability to just be free-form and just say anything, right? So I'm probably not telling you anything you have not felt, given the number of messages that you've sent around. Text is here to stay, right? Amazing staying power. And what we're going to look at in a little bit more detail here is what's happening at the intersection of texting, messaging, and natural language processing, right? There's actually a long lineage of activity on that front. I don't know how many of you have heard of ALICE. It's actually an acronym, obviously. The Artificial Linguistic Internet Computer Entity, and it came out in 1995. It turns out it won the Libner Prize 3 times, Best AI at the time between 2001 and 2004. But it's actually, sadly, not Turing test ready. And that's okay, because there's a lot of goodness that can happen, below that threshold, right? A lot of you probably remember Aardvark. Came out and was sold to Google, I think, in 2010 for about 50 million. And what it let you do was effectively text the system, and the system would essentially try to figure out roughly what you were saying, assign some tags to that, and then route you to someone who could actually help you answer the question you were asking, right? Today, the bar has gotten much higher, right? We've built a set of expectations around what it's like to interact with a system like that. And Harvard, however cool it was, probably wouldn't cut it today, and certainly not Alice. We certainly have come to expect that any system we interact with has some kind of mechanism in place to retain context, to build memory about my preferences, around what's going on, so short-term, long-term context. And obviously, given what we've just talked about and the fact that it's so slow to text, we expect our texting-centric apps to leverage any kind of sensor we can, right? We also expect a lot of integrations. This phone, that I carry in my pocket has hundreds of apps on it. They all do something specific, as we saw, but it would be nice if they could all talk to each other and be glued together through text. So what's going on now is actually fascinating for a number of reasons. We're going to look at the kind of players that have come on the scene in the last few months. I kind of feel that Siri paved the way. When it came out in 2007 out of SRI, everyone was kind of blown away by the number of integration points they had with third-party services, right? And that's probably why, $200 million later, we all have Siri on our phones, right? It's also the case that it was a bit disappointing. I mean, after the first moment of excitement, we all came and said, well, she's kind of dumb, right? The question has become, what do we do next, right? The reason why this is becoming more and more relevant now is the offline and online worlds are very much blending, right? There's a lot of the tasks we perform today that can very much, cross the line between offline and online. So you turn to your phone, increasingly often to do just about anything, right? The on-demand economy has essentially given rise to a service or multiple services to do just about anything, Uber and Lyft, HomeJoy and Handy, Hotel Tonight. All these services are there to essentially put a lot of power at your fingertips, right? There's also a massive explosion of data. Maybe it's cheap storage, maybe it's cheap compute, but there's certainly like a massive amount of data that gets created every day. And we're trying to exploit that and make use of it for, to our own interest, right? We're also busier than ever, and so it's natural that we're effectively trying to constantly do more stuff faster. right? We're competing on knowledge. We're trying not to drown in the noise, right? And there's so much technical fabric to leverage when it comes to what's available for me out there as a consumer, right? That finding a way to like string all of this stuff together is becoming more and more crucial, right? Even simple tasks can very quickly get complex, right? If I want to arrange a business trip to New York, you know, I'm gonna need some transportation to and from the airport. I'm gonna need a hotel room. I'm gonna need some restaurant reservation, and I have not even begun doing anything business related, right? So there's a new crop of players that's come onto the scene literally in the last couple of months. And most of them have a messaging-centric interface. We're seeing two current schools of thoughts, and I think they're going to end up blending. So I think of them more as on a continuum, on a spectrum, rather than just two discrete points. But you see a lot of human-powered services. And then you see, separately today, you see these bots, right? And I'll kind of walk you through some of what we've been looking at as interesting stuff. I don't know how many of you are on all of these services or any. I've tried them all. They're super interesting for very different reasons. You can see that. So this is the crop of stuff that's essentially human-powered, right? There's a text interface. In some cases, there isn't any application for you to download. If you take the case of Magic or Go Butler, these guys promise to get anything done for you. What you do is you literally pick up your phone, text Magic or text Go Butler, and someone materializes out of the ether on the other side and starts, you know, talking to you via text, right? And essentially get shit done for you, right? They have integration points with things like PayPal, so that once they figure out exactly what this flight to New York is going to look like, they can book it for you, right? Operator is focusing on retail, and they essentially put you in touch with someone who can figure out exactly what kind of pair of jeans you need. Assist is all about making you feel like a local when you travel and you want to figure out like where to go and spend your evening, right? So night on the town, sort of facilitated by a local expert. Chloe kind of does similar things. And as far as we're concerned, Fountain, we are essentially on a mission to connect you on the spot with a specialist, an expert who can help you and assist you answer any kind of question you're facing. We came out about 4 weeks ago with our first vertical having to do with home and garden. So it's Saturday, you're here today, but you're thinking about this project that you have to deal with at home. It could be a leaky faucet, it could be something more ambitious, maybe you're redesigning somebody's some kid's room at home, and you know that there's maybe this 5-10% of expertise you're lacking, and so Fountain is there to essentially, through a text-centric interface at first, understand what you're asking about and put you in touch with the exact right expert who can be available to help you right now, right? I won't dwell too much on Fountain. You guys can find it on the App Store, but we're kind of like, I would say, at least right now, part of this crop that is primarily putting you in touch with a human being through a text interface. There's another side to this current crop, and those guys are effectively human-free, right? What they're trying to do is, figure out a way to converse with you on a somewhat limited basis so that you can achieve, you can complete a task, right? I won't go through all of them, but essentially, Luka, for instance, as an example, tries to do with AI and NLP what Chloe and Assist are doing with a human being, right? So it's a team out of New York. They've been working on this for about 2 years, and I actually invite you guys to go and check it out. It's pretty interesting. They're effectively able to figure out from free-form text the kind of restaurants you're interested in, the size of party, the neighborhood, this kind of stuff, right? I won't even go into what happens when you try to reach into the offline world. So Alfred is super interesting. It's literally a human being showing up to your house twice a week, trying to coordinate your Instacart deliveries and Google Express deliveries and your HomeJoy services. So now we've crossed way into the future, right? But as far as online, these are like some of the key players right now. So what I want to focus on next is like what kind of technologies, what kind of building blocks are there for us to build this kind of stuff and bring natural language processing to bear in an environment like that that's actually particularly suitable because there's literally no distinction in the ways we interact with a system versus a human being when it comes to text, right? Like machines and humans are literally on equal footing in that sense. It's the exact same interface, right? So first of all, the arms race is on. I don't know how closely you guys have been following what's gone on with Deep Link. It was acquired for $500 million by Google, and even though they've been in the press for all sorts of things, including, for instance, being able to teach their system how to play vintage video games from Atari, and they won a prize for that. I bet that they're doing much more than that with their NLP, right? Another team that has to be called out is the Viv team. So these are actually the founders from Siri. So the guys who spun out of SRI in 2007, sold to Apple, launched this, and essentially what their ambition is to take things like that and actually get it done for you. So there's, for instance, this example at the bottom where you're on your way to dinner at your brother's house, and this is the kind of stuff that they're able to act on. So what's going to happen there is not just the natural language processing component, but they're going to be able to figure out what you're trying to accomplish with that and how to effectively look up your brother's address based on the fact that he might be in your address book, figure out where you are, decide essentially what kind of detour you're willing to take so that you end up on a corridor that has wine stores. It's going to be able to look up lasagna as a type of food and figure out what kind of wine pairing works well with that. It's going to be able to make a recommendation, and then it's going to suggest a couple of wine stores along the way for you to do that. So it's very much about agency. We talked about how there's very little tolerance for lack of common sense in these services. So I'll give you two examples. This actually happened to me. One of them interacting with a human being, the other interacting with a machine. They're actually very similar in sort of where they fall short. I was looking for a restaurant in the Mission District, and that's what I wrote. And I was given a suggestion for something on Mission Street, but at 2nd. So it's, anyone who lives in San Francisco knows that it's not the same thing. It's perfectly forgivable for a system not to know that, but it's very annoying as well. So the bar is very high. The second system, the second example, sorry, essentially came out of something where I'm like, hey, I want to go to Seattle. I'm in San Francisco. And the system didn't know that Washington, D.C. is on the other coast. From Seattle, Washington, right? And so little mistakes like that make it so quick to realize that you get frustrated and it's not worth it. So to sort of remedy this situation, what we're really looking for, of course, is a magical experience, right? You guys have all heard of the third law of Arthur C. Clarke, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Clearly, we're not yet there. So suddenly, like any good magician, it's all about great misdirection, right? What kind of approaches can we take, and what kind of tricks can you play so that it feels right? We talked about the hybrid approach. I won't belabor that. I just wanted to point out these guys. It's a team out of Rochester University. They are working on a project called Chorus, and what they do is they essentially have not one, but a group of humans who are helping you and appear to you, the consumer, as one entity. And so what happens is they've set up a system that has a consensus building mechanism baked in. A bunch of people are multitasking multiple conversations at once. They all essentially submit a suggested answer to your question, and they start voting on who's given the best answer. And next thing you know, about 95% of the time, the subject, the consumer in question, is convinced that A, they're speaking with one person, but B, they're getting a lot done because you have a bunch of sort of specialized domain experts who can handle different parts of the conversation, from making a great recommendation to getting you there, for instance, right? One of the most sort of broadly used trick is to essentially constrain the input, right? One of the jokes that comes to mind is how everyone feels like they're such a great artist when they're using Instagram filters, right? When really they've constrained your input, so you essentially end up picking between the blue filter and the red filter, but you feel so creative, right? So it's all about misdirection. It's like, how do you move people along while giving them a sense that they're being creative? In fact, you lost free-form expressiveness, right? Of course, multiple options. That's something we do at Fountain, right? Sometimes we're not sure about what you said, and we have a couple of options in mind that could be a good fit. And instead of like sending you down a rabbit hole, we actually ask confirmation early on, right? Something that the guys at Thumbtack are doing that's also super interesting is essentially they've put together through a combination of handcrafting and learning a number of questionnaires that they put you through that are adaptive questionnaires, so that you start with an open-ended question or sentence. They try to categorize what you said, but then before they hand you off to someone who's going to help you, let's say with a project at home, they actually put you through these 5 to 6 to 7 questions. And by the time you're done, you've grown smarter because they actually know exactly what they should be asking, so that the question becomes better qualified, right? And then, of course, that's what we do at Fountain, for instance. We harvest specialized knowledge. So I mentioned earlier the example that the Viv guys have given around how they'll be able to give you great recommendations for wine. What we care about at Fountain is putting you in touch with the exact right person. So Alexi put us on the spot here when he mentioned that we started our life as a company by scraping a bunch of skills and job postings on LinkedIn. We actually went to a bunch of websites, and what we've acquired is essentially a skill graph for what we think is the entirety of human skills out there, 70,000 of those or so. And more importantly, beyond the skills alone, the way they connect, right? So we're able to know that someone who lists on their resume something like JDBC is probably a good all-around Java programmer, right? And SBT and Skala are fairly closely related as well. What that allows us to do in practice is expand the search of experts that we want to put you in touch with when you come in with a question. So, ideally, when you come in with a question around wanting to remodel your guest room with a theme that's about mid-century modern, we look for that exact interior designer, but we don't want to get you stuck because we just so happen to have someone who's a slightly different style of interior design, right? So we broaden the scope and the radius very quickly. We have essentially algorithms that gives us interesting data around the distance between skills, right? And how much we're willing to decay the accuracy of the match before we put you in touch with somebody, right? Of course, one of the things that we've gotten used to because we've all learned to speak Google is instant feedback, right? You go, you make a search. If you don't like the results you see, you know what to do. You quickly change your query 1 or 2 words, right? And so that's something that you don't want to lose with text. You want to be able to quickly fix your mistake at no cost and get a different set of results, right? So that's something that's baked into a lot of these user experiences as well. And then, of course, we talked about long and short-term context and memory. Very important for people to get a sense that the magic is working and that the system understands and knows them. So build a set of preferences. So if the lasagna wine pairing suggestion was a hit, I'm going to remember that you like cabs. If not, I should probably keep that off the list for next time, right? Now, that was all about misdirection. Let's talk about the tools that we can actually bring to bear when it comes to trying to put together these agents that are going to get us help when it comes to executing tasks, right? Quite frankly, where we spend the most of our time today at Fountain is classic classification problems, right? So we've gone from linear classifiers that are very much an exercise in supervised learning, where we've handcrafted the features over time, essentially trying to understand what matters most to the problem at hand for us, right? We're starting to dabble into more interesting sort of approaches that try to minimize the supervised aspect of the learning. I'll go a little bit more into what that means in a second. When it comes to essentially a more open-ended clustering exercise, you're starting to see a lot of advances there where progress is being made, for instance, using various technologies, such as we talked about mixture models, for instance, right? And then you go into, sort of like the buzzwords of the day, right? So neural networks. Frankly, today, most of the stuff that's happening there is happening on GPUs. It's happening on CUDA. It's happening with Torch, right? And so if you want to help us make this run on the JVM on a GPU, come and help us. That feels like it's a very early stage problem, but there's a lot of interesting stuff. So when it comes to recurrent neural networks, right, that's something that's now starting to be used in very interesting ways. For instance, when it comes to figure out what a word you haven't seen before is about, right? So it's about analyzing the morphology of a word, right? So being able to look at a word and break it down into its parts and understand sort of what class of concept it designates based on its sole morphology, right? So people are now using recurring neural networks to try and figure that out in a way that's unsupervised, right? When it comes to the convolutional neural networks, right, we're starting to see a transition from primarily image processing and image recognition tasks, right, to natural language processing tasks, right? There's one team from Oxford that has essentially put together a dynamic convolutional network that is able to compete in terms of performance with a classifier that's been trained with essentially no supervision. They are able to achieve similar levels of accuracy on a number of similar tasks, right? And there's another team, I think a little bit earlier, from NEC and Google that's achieved like very similar results as well. So again, keeping in mind the context of today's conference, we're talking about text and we're talking about Scala a lot, right? That's certainly what we use. There's a lot of work still to be done to make that stuff available directly on Scala. A lot of that stuff, again, CUDA and Torch, right? When it comes particularly with the very compute-intense tasks of convolution for these neural networks. The last thing I wanted to touch on was beyond just the pure NLP component of what's going on. I don't know how many of you have looked at this BDI system, so belief, desire, intention, right? That's effectively what's powered Siri. Essentially a model to represent intention in rational agents, right? So the ability to predict intention and to tackle problems and tasks by having a model for how to weigh conflicting options, keeping into account state, which is effectively the set of beliefs that are held, input, as in desires, and intentions that are effectively plans, right? So if you think about a BDI system, it breaks down the tasks of reasoning into two subsets, deliberation and effectively the what we're trying to do, from the means to ends reasoning about how we're going to do that, right? And what a BDI system effectively does is in a very modular fashion, because these goals are effectively trees that go from a goal to a subplan that is in self, recursively a goal with a subplan, and so on and so forth. They're able to build a lot of complexity, but in a way that is iterative and progressive. Okay, so you start with a very simple system, and then you build more wisdom into it. From a logic standpoint, the goal succeeds if at least one of the plans succeed, and then the plan succeeds if all of its steps succeed. And so you start traversing this graph this way. When it comes to Scala, which is close to what we care about because the entire stack is built on Scala, BDI systems are very interesting because there are some libraries out there, I'm just mentioning one here, that leverage the fact that actor systems, ACA obviously, are very sort of closely matched to the kind of tasks that the BDI systems do. So a very interesting area of focus and interest to us. Just wanted to have a quick shout out for the tools that we are looking at. We're very much fans of the Stanford NLP library at Fountain. And we're also looking at things like Factory, which is something I think you guys, if you've been to some of the talks at the Skala meetups, you may have heard the work of the Factory, the main contributor to the library. Datumbox and deep learning are also two interesting Scala or Java-ready libraries. That's what I wanted to cover, sort of like the state of messaging, the way we look at it today. So thank you, and if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them.
We certainly have time for questions.
Or coffee. Of course.
So, given all this entrance to the market, right? Amazon, obviously, 800-pound gorilla. Where do you see this going? What do you envision as the kind of the best value for the consumer, and how you're going to get there?
I think for at least a couple of years, you're going to see most of the more palatable and most convincing solutions be hybrid solutions, right? I think I'm definitely looking at Viv very closely. I think these guys are definitely hardcore. They're perhaps like one of the more credible teams out there when it comes to like really hard AI. So you're going to see the two ends of that spectrum kind of come close together.
And what do you think do we need to improve in NLP? What are the weak points? Like you mentioned, Washington State and Seattle, Washington. So like this is world knowledge, right? So do we need to focus on building better world knowledge, or do we need to bring in kind of cutting-edge academic grammars and parsers? Where do you think the best improvement is?
So as always with these things, I think of it as something that carries like diminishing returns, and yet even though we get closer to the asymptotic point, it still gets frustrating, so it's still worth the effort, right? And that's very much something that I think has to do with, to your point, better recognition for like specific entities and whatnot. I think the other side of that is what I touched on when it comes to agency, right? And the fact that we are able to start plugging into modules that know how to perform the task. So we looked at the example around like getting me on a flight to Paris tomorrow and returning next weekend. That presupposes a lot of interaction with modules that can do something.
And so another question I have is, so yesterday at the panel, Jeremy Howard said that basically if he were doing ML now, basically you should drop everything and do deep learning, right? Deep learning is going to kill everything. If you're not doing deep learning, you're doing it wrong. So I wonder if you subscribe to this, what's your take on that?
That's why I was saying that we were hiring, and we definitely want help making the transition. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you see the texting as replacing current like HTML interfaces on a lot of the web, or is this like in addition to that in the future? Or?
So I see a lot of movement around interfaces that are text-centric, as in you literally like you type, but they're not necessarily outside of an app. They're sometimes in an app, and you sort of end up with the best of both worlds, where a lot of the responses you get come in the form of not just like a piece of plain text, but something that's, let's say, a card where you see like a restaurant review, or you see a button to call an Uber for you, or things like that, right? So suddenly, you sort of multiply and amplify the throughput and sort of like the richness of the interface, right? And again, it's more of a hybrid take on that. So lots of free-form ability through texting, but also augmented by a specialized rich UI when it matters. So I don't imagine that just text, as in there's no app, is necessarily the only way.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that founding you have 700,000 skills. And do you have example how you can identify what particular would represent a skill?
So what we effectively have is so 70,000 skills. A lot of them have synonyms, right? Some of our work essentially is about disambiguation. There's a lot of words that you can imagine have different meanings. So the classic example, of course, C bass versus the bass guitar, right? So acquiring the skill, when we look at someone, one of the things we're trying to do at Fountain is when we onboard one of our experts, we try to minimize the amount of work they have to do. And so we try to infer their skills by looking at their LinkedIn profile and things like that. So being able to represent these skills in our system with not just the word that we attach to them, the label, but also the context for it, what kind of general category they fall into is important. So we can derive general context from, let's say, the resume we're looking at and assign the correct meaning for Java. Is it coffee or is it programming, right? So we essentially maintain this graph in the form of a large matrix that's sparsely populated, and this represents the connections between these graphs, right? And the weights in terms of proximity in meaning. Yeah?
And what do you think about Siri or Google now? Are they future competitors of services you mentioned?
Oh yeah, I definitely think when I mentioned in passing that the arms race was on, I don't think Apple is going to sit on their laurels after the Siri acquisition, unless they just buy Viv again. I don't think that's the ambition for them, though. I think Viv is very much about being ubiquitous this time around. Google now, and the fact that they picked up DeepMind definitely feels like they're gearing up to achieve the same kind of service. Thanks, guys.